Hi, everyone. We're live with EdTech Team Online. We have another Hangout on air tonight, or this morning, depending on where you're at, which we're going to be talking to a special guest today. um, and he's going to be telling us a little bit about his experience with visual literacy in the classroom. I just want to remind everyone that as you're watching, or if you're watching the recording after this, make sure to tweet out what you're learning using our hashtag EdTechTeamOnline. I'm Dominique. I'm going to be moderating the chat tonight and just kind of watching the back channel. So please share any questions you have. If you're watching live with us, or if you want to ask them later on Twitter, that's great as well. But I keep wanting to say tonight, but Jim, it's not tonight where you're at. So go ahead and tell us a little bit about yourself and where you're at in the world and your experience in education.
Yeah, well, thanks, Dominique. It's great to be here. Hello, everybody. My name is Jim Sill, and I am in Melbourne, Australia. So depending on where you are in the world, it might be tomorrow for where I am, and it is in the morning. So it feels good. I don't know about you guys, but I'm getting ready for my day. Many of you are wrapping it up. But I come from the television business, and for about 10 years, and then one day somebody convinced me to become a classroom teacher. So I taught in Visalia, California, at a high school called El Diamante High School, where I taught video and film production. And it was a great experience. And so now I work directly with EdTech Team, and I'm based here out of Australia. So we're talking about visual literacy. So that's right along my whole life. So I'm excited to get started. Yeah, Dominique, do you any other things we want to cover before we get started?
No, I think that's great. We're excited to hear about your experience, I guess, in television and in education. And I always love hearing your story about how you ended up in the classroom. But yeah, we're excited to learn with you because I know out of our 6 courses, this is often the course that educators say they never expected to be in a teacher leader cohort. They didn't expect to learn about maybe some design or visual literacy. So go ahead, take it away.
Yeah, thanks. It's to get started, visual literacy is a big beast, and we're not going to cover it in about 20 minutes. So there are a lot of things to talk about, but I really just want to focus on a few things. But I want to share with you guys to get started an experience I just had. So if you look at this slide that I have up here, this is a picture from the top of Jim Falls in Kakadu, Arnhem Land here in Australia. So it is a protected national park, and at one time is where a lot of the indigenous people, many of the indigenous people of Australia lived. And I had this amazing opportunity to hike for about 15 days with an incredible group of people along this incredible path that took us around. And it was eye-opening for a number of reasons, obviously because of this incredible landscape. But along the way, along our hike, there were opportunities to see rock art, right? So this is just art or symbols that were drawn on rock that are between, I don't know, thousands of years old. So many of the pieces that we saw were between 8 and 20,000 years old. And I was so amazed by it, but I want to share with you that I brought with me some issues. So as a former film teacher, as a former TV guy, I learned how to read an image a long time ago. And what I found myself doing as I was looking at some of these pieces, and here's a great photo that I took from that website there. I think Dominique's probably going to share this slide deck too, so you can access some of this. Is that I thought rock art was going to be simple, and it was just going to be lines, and it was just going to be things that people thousands of years ago hunted, just to sort of be clear and vulnerable about my biases. And what I found over the course of 15 days and the discussions I had with other people from Australia, people from other countries, is that there's so much more to that. And I brought with me, when looking at these images, this background that didn't apply. And I really felt like after many days of walking and talking about these pieces that we saw on the rock, is that how little I knew, and how I needed to have so much more information to fully, truly understand what I was looking at. And that really, that visual literacy that I don't have, that I don't know if I'll ever have, that to be able to fully appreciate and understand the pieces that I saw on those walls, it really kind of reinforced today's talk, like how important it is to be able to fully understand. So I wanted to share with you just really like a personal literacy plan. This is something I walk through my life with, and I just feel like I can narrow it down to these three pieces. There's so many more pieces to visual literacy, but one is that how do we interpret images and attempt to understand its context? So there in Arnhem Land, I don't know the context. Where those pieces were drawn have changed over the thousands of years. And so had I been able to see that artist drawing it, I feel like I would have been able to understand a little bit more about what I was seeing. But I didn't have that. And so as I look at other pieces, I realize that that's an important part of my plan, right? How do I understand the context? How do I understand that image in its context? How do we understand the history of that image, that sort of thing? The other thing I walked away when I came back into Darwin, Australia, that is how keenly aware I was of my own personal view of the world and things around me. I guess we call that bias, and we bring a lot of our bias into visual literacy, don't we? Into things we see. And then the last thing is, and it didn't necessarily apply to what was going on there in Northern Australia, but it's this idea, and I learned from television, is that the author may be attempting to manipulate you. And so how do we know what to look for? Anyways, I wanted to share those things with you because that's when I look at pieces, when I look at art, when I look at anything I see coming at me, either on the road, up on a billboard, or in a magazine, or does anybody read magazines anymore? But and maybe something like television commercials, that sort of thing. Here's a big bombarding slide that breaks every rule of slide design, but I really wanted you to have access to this when you look at this slide deck, because this comes from one of the many mesh guides that are out there. But I highlighted some things that I think are important for teachers, to be able to understand, and for your students, perhaps you, to know. And I think a couple of these that are in there just really reinforce what I was just saying about my own personal experiences, that images are made for a reason, right? These images are made for a specific purpose. And I think that those images can be manipulated over time. Images can be misinterpreted because of you don't know what the context is. But also I think that the cultural and collective meaning of images is important. So, I love this idea of visual literacy because it is so cross-curricular, because we do need to know a number of different things, like how does rock art stay on the wall for so many thousands of years, and the science behind it, the history behind it, and just the written language of those people before. Was there any? That sort of thing. So anyways, I wanted you to have access to this because I think it's an important piece to understand when you're starting to teach visual literacy, or to help you teach visual literacy differently. But what I love is to steal a line from my English teacher friends, is that close reading. I think close reading is an important part of understanding images, right? So being able to look at something deeply, being able to read more into something that we normally do with text, into our images. And so I found this great website from the New York Times. This is the blog that they put together, but this particular link that you see there is from 10 photographs to teach close reading and visual thinking skills. Because if you look at even that image of this boy, I believe it's a boy, doing what I believe is a backflip off of what I believe to be trash, there's all sorts of amazing discussions that come from that, right? Like even from my description of it right there, how much of my biases was in that, and what are you seeing differently? And ultimately, the biggest question I have from something like that is, how could somebody be so happy to do backflips in an environment like that? Because that's me bringing my Western ways into it, right? And so it's really it can be wonderful discussions. It can be a wonderful topic for your students to start with. And if you're ever really looking for images that can tell that story, this is it. That link is a great way to start. And as you start to recognize images that tell a different story, you'll see them. But here's another thing that I think is great for us to have our students ask about images, right? So again, another list of many words that you probably can't read from where you're at, but it's really, really cool to get kids to start looking at what's going on in this image. Like, what do they think is happening? I met an English teacher many years ago when I first started teaching, and he said that he loves to get his students to tell them their opinion, to tell him their opinion. And then he gives them permission to change it. And that's just this wonderful thing that always just came out. So getting kids to not have fear of being able to say, what do I see? You know, creating a safe environment, a culture in your classroom that gets them to be open about what they see. And then, of course, identifying the things that make you say that, right? But and then trying to understand author purpose, right? I think that many of the authors that we know, especially if we, in the next couple of slides, those authors are gone. You know, they were alive hundreds of years ago, and they're not here to argue you're being right or wrong, which I love, right? You know, if you've ever taken an art class, you know, especially at university, there always seems to be a black and white piece to art or visuals, but the reality is that's not even true. You know, you can have any thought you want behind an image. So anyways, I thought these questions might help, because as we go through the next piece, I want to introduce you, if you don't already know it, to the Google Arts and Culture website. So artsandculture.google.com is one of my favorite websites. You know, if you've ever seen me or other people at our Google conferences that we produce or summits, I love talking about the arts and culture resource, because there's so much going on in there that you have access to. For example, this wonderful painting, it'll maybe come up here in a second. This wonderful painting is called In the Loge. In the Loge is a painting by Mary Stevenson Cassett, a woman from Philadelphia who ended up in Paris and hanging out with all the cool people. But I love this painting because it really does talk about a lot of things. And one, we can do some close reading on this. We can look at the image, what this woman was wearing, what technology she's using, who that creepy guy is in the background staring at her. But I love it because it brings my film background into it, and it has to do with framing. I feel like Mary Cassett does a lot of amazing images where she crops out what you think might be the subject. In the film business, we call that the restricted narrative. What you don't see is what engages you as the viewer. And so you start thinking, what is she looking at? And I put some questions there for you to maybe access at another time. But I love it because when you look at this, it says, what's going on off screen? What do you think she's looking at? And what do you know about this image? So, for example, you can probably guess she's at the opera or some sort of performance, because those are the title itself gives that away. But when you look at, a lot of people will say that she's looking at the stage, and what I would ask you is, what do you know about the stage when the production is happening? What do you know about the house lights that when there's something going on stage? And they always turn the house lights down. And so you know from this image, she's not looking at the stage. And so those lines that are drawn like by your brain, you can sort of get a sense she's not looking down. You know that other person's looking at her. And so she's kind of caught between you and I. She's caught between that person looking at her and you and me in this sort of like sandwich. Yeah, it's really incredible. What I love about her is that the painter, Mary Stevenson Cassett, she does other things like this amazing painting. It's not necessarily in the Google Arts and Culture project, but this is a beautiful scene. Many of you experience it pretty much every day. But if you look at the woman is gazing off, and you look at the child looks almost as happy as can be. And there's a lot going on here, right? What do you think is happening? What do you think is going on with that woman and that look? And so, and look at the bear hug she's giving that child, you know, so the squirmy 2-year-old that maybe is sitting on the bed. There's just a lot of wonderful things that you bring into this with your own experiences. And there's, you know, I always sort of look at this and wonder, who is the subject? Is it the child, or is it the woman? Is it the woman's gaze? That sort of thing. Notice the lines that come off the child's eyes and from the woman. Notice the lines from the bedside table. You know, there's lots of wonderful things that come from this. Wonderful pieces of discussion. And then lastly, I'll just sort of talk to you about Degas, because Mary Cassatt, she hung out with Degas a lot, and Degas had a very similar style, the Impressionists. But this painting comes so, I don't know, it says a lot to me. And and I sort of have some questions there for you as you sort of look at this woman, I think, is the subject, and that glass of whatever it might be, absinthe or whatever it might be at that time. And how reluctant she seems to drink it. You know, and look at this guy next to her. Woo! This guy's the handsomest devil in all of Paris. Anyways, there's a lot happening there, right? So I think when we learn to look at images and we learn to read them, so much discussion can come from it. And as I always like to say, like we can examine photos, but how do we create them? And these things, looking at images like this, how can we recreate this image today? You know, what student, is this a student in a cafeteria drinking her, you know, or her 15th Diet Coke of the day, or whatever it might be? You know, it can be really interesting, I think. How do we get kids to recreate these images that look so old, you know, like history, blah, but we can really bring that into today, can't we? Cool. Well, you know, there's a lot of things that come from an image like that. There's lots of ways to read this, looking at a lot of the things that you see here. One of my favorites is this idea of social distance. The way the author or the artist puts the subject, how close they put that subject to you. And that brings up to light a number of different things, especially my film work, right? So work I've done in the film business. When I say film, I don't mean actual film, I mean filmmaking. And I think that there's a lot of really cool things that we can relate to that when it comes to the visual language. I stole this from a friend of mine. So it's just really stealing when they're a friend, a guy named Frank Gutler. And Frank Gutler, he's out there in California doing a lot of amazing things, travels around talking about filmmaking. But he created this slide for when he was at AFI, American Film Institute. And I love the comparisons between the written word and what we would consider the film language. You know, we look at the sentences that are alike, that have a similar sort of theme, context. They're paragraphs. And those paragraphs become chapters and then, of course, novels. And when we look at filmmaking and the individual shot, it's like a sentence, because a number of shots in the same area are called scenes. And a number of scenes create sequences, and of course, the movie. And it's wonderful because when I was a student, I didn't look at the top. I hardly ever read unless I had to. And then even then, I probably didn't. But I did a lot of the bottom. And so a lot of the literacy I developed came from visual literacy. A lot of that language I developed came from shots, because the shots are interesting, just like sentences are interesting. And I often share about how you probably write sentences to people you love, and potentially write emails to people you hate. And you use different language, don't you? We use different words in those sentences to make up, to emphasize. And so what you don't see in Frank's slide here is the words that make up a sentence, the images, the elements that are in a shot that make up the mood, right? And we call that, by the way, mise en scène, which is my bad French for what you see here. The elements that make up a shot. These are the pieces that filmmakers drop in to give you a sense, a feeling. You know, remember the TV show Friends? You know, remember, like all those things that are placed in there, somebody got paid to put in there. So everything has meaning, everything. You know, from the hat or the guitar, from the flowers that you see, from what's going on outside that window, to the nasty couch that probably stinks after hundreds of people sitting on it every day. There's this amazing piece that comes with that. These are the words that make up a sentence in filmmaking, in that. And so one of the things when I teach this is that you always have to sort of recognize that everything is on purpose. Nothing is by accident. And if it's been paid for, nothing is by accident. You know, another thing we can look at with film is this language of angles, right? So the viewpoints. And so these are my three favorite. There are many, and you could if you were a film teacher or if you were a film student, you would argue that there are lots more. But I think when we look at images that are being shown to us, there's a language that's being spoken to you. For example, high angles. High angles make the subject look vulnerable, or you, the viewer, are more powerful than they are. Does that make sense? That you are above them? Whereas low angles have the opposite effect, that the subject on the screen is more powerful than you, that you, the viewer, are suddenly vulnerable yourself. And then, of course, the Germans created what they call the Dutch angle. It used to be called the Deutsch angle because of Germans. But the Dutch angle really shows you this uneasiness, this tension. Anytime I see the Dutch angle, I always wonder why the author is trying to make me feel uneasy. And most of the time, it's so many drug-induced issues, even psychological, if you will. But there's other reasons we see it. And you should always sort of have a question about why. Okay. So there's some things in there I think are really great when you're watching. A lot of the stuff came from this guy, D.W. Griffith. So D.W. Griffith showed up in the late 1900s, so 1908-ish, if you will. And he, by the 19-teens, started defining the language of film based really on purpose or out of necessity. He has a lot of issues with him. There's some real major issues that he ended up in, but the reality of it is that he developed this language that we know about. So if you're interested in teaching that history, look him up. He's an incredible guy, but we often, there's a lot of issues with him. But this is what came out of it: is that he came up with these incredible shot types. And these are the things I wanted to share with you to help you see film or television differently. These shots, I think, are the most commonly used because I believe they help to create empathy for what you see on the screen. So here is the author manipulating you. And it's the authors, or the director, if you will, a cinematographer, they will create these images to make you think a certain way. They'll put them in a certain order to make you think a certain way. And this is what they really sort of look like. I do a thing called the 4-shot film story, which can be a fun little project where kids go out and film these 4 shots. But I'll explain them to you because it's important. The establishing shot always starts a scene. Almost always. You'll see at the very start of every scene, establishing shot, the where and the when are we, right? So in this case, it's a school. You can get a sense for that big logo. We're outside of some building, that sort of thing. And the establishing shot is almost always followed by the subject in the scene, in the setting you established. And the reason we can do that is we stay far enough away from them. We call that a long shot. We stay far enough away from them to where they are in the scene we established. And then we move closer to the medium shot. The medium shot is something that we do as teachers. We call that proximity. And the medium shot shows you less of where we are and more of who we are, right? And we can see more details. Details of the character, details of the things that are around them. And then the close-up is where we have what I like to refer to as intimacy with the subject. So intimacy with the subject is important because what is normally small, inconsequential, suddenly is put large on the screen. So if it's large on the screen, we're being forced to focus on it. And so I think that's an important piece to understand as well. So the close-up. So these 4 shots tell us a story, right? In this particular case, it's about a kid who just got kicked out of the library for using electronics. But we can see this everywhere we go in filmmaking and television. In many cases, we see the establishing shot is fake. So a lot of times we see establishing shots of New York City, in the streets and the honking and the beep beeps and all this different taxi cabs rolling by. And then we see a character in front of a door. We think this is New York City, this wonderful show. I love this show in New York City. And it's totally not New York City. It's like LA. And it's not even outside. It's on a studio set. It's incredible how the establishing shot, in many cases, actually purchased footage from some company that goes around making wide shots of things. And the long shot is the character in the location that we established. I often like to share that if we took away the establishing shot of a school and replaced it with a prison, and we see that kid standing in front of that door, we think that kid's at a prison. And so it's interesting how one shot can change everything, right? One shot can change everything.
Yeah, that's crazy when you put it like that.
Yeah, yeah. It's funny because you, the viewer, are doing that, right? That's your fault. And it's you could argue whose fault it really is, but it's really your fault. It's what you've brought to the table. I put some videos in here for you to look at later on, but for example, here's an establishing shot from the Monsters Inc. And so to really reinforce what establishing shots are, this is all drawn, right? Somebody had to draw every element here. So that's how you know everything is being seen and shown on purpose. That establishing shot is followed by the two characters that are in the location. It's really fantastic to see how many examples you can find online of that language being told to you. And then I put another video in here of a great school, Point England, out in Auckland, New Zealand, done by Google. So these high-end professional companies putting together these high-end videos. And I love it. I put it in there to help you try to find the shots that I just spoke about and what purpose they serve. So just a little activity for you to be able to look at later. And as I sort of begin to wrap it up, I want you to know this is the pessimistic guy in me, that you always should be careful of the cut. The edit is something I learned a long time ago, is how you trick people. Right. But no film is ever going to just stick a camera in the corner and you watch it all unfold. That's called a play, and you go to a theater for that. Whereas in filmmaking, the edit, and television especially, by the way, the edit can be really tricky. And this is an example of what I'm talking about. This guy named Kuleshov, which some Russian guy, some Soviet communist guy back in the day, he only had this certain amount of film. The film on the left, the guy. He had the same image of the guy and he repeated it multiple times. So it's just this guy staring at the camera. And what this guy Kuleshov did is he cut in, so cut the film, it literally cut it, inserted in film of child in a coffin, back to the man, a plate of food, back to the man, and then a woman lounging on a couch, back to the man. And people said that he was the greatest actor of all time. But it was actually the same image of the same guy doing exactly that. Because what happened is that when you combine two shots together, it creates a meaning. And that meaning is created by you. So for example, when you showed the man and the child in the coffin, he was sad. When you showed the man and a plate of food, he was hungry. And when you showed the man looking at that woman on the couch, he got a little dirty. And that's actually you doing that. That's actually you creating that meaning. And it's incredible. It's an incredible thing. It's called the Kuleshov effect. And if my Wi-Fi was strong enough, thank you, Australia, that I would show you this video. It's Alfred Hitchcock Loves Bikinis. I don't know who put it there, but it's actually from an interview done with Alfred Hitchcock in the 1950s. And if you have a second, please watch it. It really reinforces the Kuleshov effect, what Alfred Hitchcock refers to as true cinema. But it shows you how replacing those images of the child in the coffin or the woman, the plate of the food and the woman, replacing images like that change meaning. Sort of like what I was saying with the establishing shot. When you change the establishing shot, it changes the meaning of the scene. That stuff happens all the time, and we see it in television a lot, especially when we watch interviews of people on the news. Anytime you're watching an interview of a person on the news and they cut back to the interviewer responding with like sort of finger on their chin and head nod, you're being tricked, and it's most likely there's been something that's been cut out. I know this because I did it all the time, and I was told to do it by my producers, and so. Yeah, sure, sometimes nothing happens, nothing is happening, but in many cases we cut away to hide things, okay? Now that could be positive or negative. So that's up to you to figure out. I have to finish with this slide from Martin Scorsese because Edutopia, I don't know if you know the magazine. It used to be a magazine. Now it's more of a website, I suppose. Edutopia does an amazing job at really reinforcing these skills out there. It's from the George Lucas Foundation. But anyway, Scorsese, he has this wonderful interview I've put in the resources where he really talks about how powerful and how necessary visual literacy is to us, especially in today's world, which was 2006 for him at this time, but perhaps even more so even today. So I just want to give you just an idea. That last slide really shows you a number of great videos that kind of go into what I've been talking about. There's some great video from the Khan Academy that talks about close reading that I think you'll really enjoy. And then there's some other links and stuff at the end. So anyways, that was a little bit quick, potentially over 20 minutes, but hopefully useful.
Yeah, that was great. I learned a ton, and I always love hearing your stories, Jim, because I feel like you bring a whole different set of experience just to our team as EdTech team, and also just to this course. I mean, we've never had a guest speaker talk so much about film, and it was fascinating. So it was really cool. Just and how that all these educators can now pull that in as they're working on their projects. We did have a question come through. A couple of people just said they love close reading as a strategy, and they do that a lot across all subject areas. And the teachers understand why that's important. But the question was, how do you convince teachers to include visual literacy in their classes beyond just colors and fonts for student presentations?
Yeah, I think it all starts with base knowledge, right? I think we as teachers we have to focus on our subject, that we don't have enough time, if you will, to go off and have a film degree. but I think it's important, and the only way I think the best way I think you can do that is to bring in something like that Google Arts and Culture website, because what looks at like art at the top level is really littered with cross-cultural, curricular, and cultural elements that you, the teacher, can have a blast, like so much fun bringing in your subject into it. I often hear math teachers or science teachers who are like, art, there's no place for that in my room. But that website, even if you just did a search for math up in the corner of Google Arts and Culture, you'll find incredible teachers relating art and history into math. And some of you guys do that all the time already, but there's so many teachers that are still struggling with that. So yeah, that would be the way to do it, is just to sort of look at a website like that and use the search tool to be able to reinforce how important that visual literacy is. There's so much opportunity for us. To embellish that thought, as a film teacher, I felt like I always had to protect my job by making everything cross-curricular. I always feel like I was the first one on the chopping block, because they're just like, hey, what's that film guy doing? It's this kid's running around with a camera. So I always felt like I had to reinforce the need and the necessity of my program across the different curriculums, because and I felt it was also, it did my students justice by getting them to relate what they're seeing in other classrooms to me and vice versa.
Yeah, no, totally. And that's awesome that you could pull that in, or pull all those different subject areas. And we have one more question, Jim. This one came in from Twitter. Is there a way to prime the audience to elicit a particular response in a way to avoid multiple interpretations?
I guess the first thing I would say to that is, what are you afraid of? And second, and believe me, I know that answer is huge, right? There's so many answers. I'm afraid of a lot, Jim. But I think that yeah, certain images would do that. I think when you prime an audience, you're placing bias on their response, and it's kind of like, I'm going to say something probably kind of crazy. It's kind of like giving kids a rubric in a creative classroom, because if you give a rubric, you're priming them for what my expectations are. and so what they do is they give me the rubric as opposed to blowing my mind with something I never thought this project would do.
Yeah.
Ooh, I probably just caused a lot of troubles with that response, but
No, but
that's
I think that goes
how
in
you
line
prime it.
with, yeah, and that's, I mean, I think your response also goes in line with what we've been learning throughout this course or these courses. I mean, they just did a project-based learning unit, and that was totally, like letting the students run with their questions, and, just letting them take it away, which is hard because a lot of times we're used to, guiding them by the hand through all of these things. And
yeah, I did a great project in my classroom around African American history, so Black History Month, if you will, and it was really powerful because of the things that I walked away with, what I learned about my students, about the world, about Black history, and it was such a wonderful experience. And yes, obviously, there were a lot of things that came up that were uncomfortable for a lot of us, and but boy, that in those moments of being uncomfortable, isn't there so much learning taking place? So.
yeah, no, absolutely. Well said. There are lots of great nuggets, I think, for teachers to pull away from this hangout. So thank you so much, Jim, for taking the time to share with us your experience, just expertise. If there's maybe just one last piece of advice, a lot of our teachers or all of our teacher leaders, as they're working on their projects right now for visual literacy, they're going to have to be creating some visual literacy. So just through that lens, do you have any last piece of advice for these teachers?
Oh yeah, well, that 4-shot film project I talked about is a wonderful way to create in very simple ways, right? Each shot is only 4 seconds long. It's a 16-second project, if you will. And what I love is that I think a project like that, when it comes to, it's just don't forget the details, right? Don't forget the details, the mise en scène. Don't forget the details, because in the details is the language, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's not just about the subject in the picture, it's the other details. Kind of like that woman with the baby on the couch or in the bed. Sure, you can have a baby and she's wrapping her arms around it and that's the subject, but there's another thing happening in that image, right? And that other piece of that other thing happening in the image is what really brings me or you, the viewer, into it. So
No,
yeah.
absolutely. Awesome. Well, thank you so much. And for all of our teacher leaders who joined us live, thank you for being here live with us. And for those that are watching the recording, please feel free to reach out on Twitter if you have any questions for Jim. He is at Mr. Sill on Twitter, and we will see you online soon. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks for having me, guys. See you.